In the heart of South Central Kentucky, Mammoth Cave National Park is a draw for people from around the world. This area holds the longest known cave system on Earth and a rich history of family and community that reaches back generations. The people living in the Mammoth Cave area had a unique bond with those around them and to the land that would one day become a national park. Mammoth Cave, a place called home, is a tale of communities lost and a national park gained as a legacy to those who knew and loved the cave and for those who would come after. The land around Mammoth Cave, Kentucky, has been occupied for thousands of years, first by the Native Americans, and then by the settlers that came streaming through the Cumberland Gap with land grants in their hands from serving in the Revolutionary War. They settled into small communities like Joppa, Goodspring, and Silent Grove, living their lives off the land and, in later years, off of jobs working in and around the cave. Mammoth Cave became a tourist attraction in the 1800s, passing from one owner to another, finally ending up in the hands of Dr. John Cron, who at the end of his life wanted to keep the cave and surrounding land in its natural state. That idea took root, and people began talking about creating a park.
The story of us becoming a national park probably could go back to the 1800s when the first parks were being created, and shortly thereafter, there were folks who had an idea that Mammoth Cave would be a fine place for a national park, but that was kind of done on maybe a much smaller scale and never really gained much traction. But in the early 1900s, I think people started taking it much more seriously and contemplating it, and folks that ran the railroad and business people and locals started to make a kind of concerted grassroots effort to try to make that happen.
In the early part of the 20th century, several individuals tried and failed to get legislation passed to have Mammoth Cave designated as a national park. But support for the idea quietly grew, and U.S. Senator M.M. Logan was a prime advocate for the creation of the park.
1924, at the Helm Hotel here in Bowling Green, the Mammoth Cave National Park Association was constituted. M.M. Logan was put in as the first president, and they began immediately to take options on land in the park area. They took 13,000 acres, options on 13,000 acres of land at about $50 per acre, which at this time, no one could foresee that the Great Depression was fixing to hit this country. And it turned out later on they couldn't pay the options that they had took.
The Kentucky National Park Commission was established in the 1920s, and they were allowed to use eminent domain. So there were folks who willingly sold. So in the 1920s, there were people who would sell their property, and then there were others, such as the Colossal Cave, which was operated by the L&N Railroad, people that would again kind of donate or give over the land and sell and things of that sort. So there was some kind of land acquisition at that point. The bulk of it happened most likely throughout the 1930s. And in the 1930s, we were using eminent domain at that point because a lot of people were not wanting to leave. Again, as we mentioned, some did, and they didn't mind to sell their house, but others weren't selling a house per se. They were being asked to sell their home.
Now, the National Park Service is a conservation group that we know that their primary function is to conserve the natural resources, not to be sheriff. But they got saddled up with this responsibility whether they wanted to or not. And they had to go in and start taking this land. What they did, they started bringing them to Bowling Green to federal court and trying it in federal court. The people, of course, Then something had to be done because it had bogged down. It had been going on 10 years. There wasn't much progress being made towards a national park. But it created a lot of resentment when this happened. People were losing their land, their homes. And with the Great Depression in progress, you not only had the landowner who was losing his home, but you had countless tenant farmers and sharecroppers who lived on these farms, often with numerous children cast out into a harsh environment in the worst depression of the 20th century.
Hard times were nothing new to the residents of the land around Mammoth Cave, but they had always had each other to depend on, and there was something special about being a part of these communities.
My mother was 17 when she left, so her memories would be a lot different than the older people that perhaps that you've interviewed. She remembers the social events that centered around the church mostly, and the pie suppers, and walking to church with a group of children, and perhaps packing their shoes and putting them on before they got to church. And she remembers the homemade dresses, and she remembers going to people's houses and enjoying one another's company. That was way before, of course, TV and all this electronic entertainment that we have today. They were a very close-knit community. But when someone died, the Good Spring bell would ring, and they would go help dig the grave. They would have what I guess you would call a wake. They would sit with the family. Neighbors would take in food. Same thing with illnesses. If someone was sick in the community, the men would get together and they would help take the crops in or put the crops out. The women would pitch in whatever they could to help the woman that was sick. When the park got their land, they weren't allowed to take anything with them, only the clothes or what was movable in the house. And my grandfather, Daniel, was I guess we would call then a talented cabinet maker. But unfortunately, all the cabinets were attached to the walls, and they were not allowed to take them. So the only thing that my grandmother, and I may be persecuted at this point for telling this, the only thing that my grandmother managed to sneak out was a sprout of cactus and a root of a Seven Sisters rose bush that she hid deep in the bottom of a humpback trunk in order to take some piece of home with her. And my mother said that when they crossed Dickie's mill with this wagon load of stuff, she stood on the top of the hill and looked down and thought, I'll never see it again. And it just broke her heart. And she died sick about it.
My grandfather was a guide at Mammoth Cave. He was Elsie, and his father, Lewis, was actually the last black guide to leave the cave. Elsie just a little bit before that. So, and my grandfather explained to me how things were different. How before he left the cave, when anyone had something, everyone had something. When anyone needed something, everyone was available to do that. It was different. And he explained, it's not the same in the town, but that's the way it was here.
Well, I remember it very well. I was born, of course, at 27, and then we didn't move out until about 1938, so I was 9 years old when we moved out. And I do remember living in the park, or in the Mammoth Cave area. We had a tourist camp, my folks did, called Home Like Inn. We had 6 cabins and 2 rooms in the house that were rented out. So we were the closest tourist court to Mammoth Cave at that time. And that was 1.5 miles from the entrance of the cave to where we lived. Then we moved out in 1938 to move into Cave City. The land that we owned was condemned to be turned over to the National Park. Well, it was pretty rough on my family, but I thought it was great because we had an indoor toilet. But other than that, it wasn't much different. I mean, we had a lot more friends in Cave City, and it was a totally different lifestyle, but I enjoyed it. And after I'd been there for a few months or a year, I wouldn't leave it. I mean, it was great.
Well, my grandparents lived near Sand Spring, Kentucky, when the park took and bought them out. And my great-grandfather lived close to Sand Spring when he first started too. And my mother's people lived close to Buffalo. You know, there's a lot of stories, but you know, they talked about people in the community. You know, they was more like family than they was neighbors. You know, if anybody needed to have a crop put in, they'd show up and they'd help. And they wasn't no keeping hours and paying anybody. They done it and just, you know, they helped each other out and made sure each person had enough to live, you know.
Well, this is home. This is where I was born. I was born about, 400 yards over near the picnic, or in the picnic area. Born in December the 3rd, 1931. My family, both sides, lived here, from here, grew up here. From 31 till we left in 35, I guess it was, no, it was 36. At the time, I was so young, I guess I didn't understand it. I remember seeing the truck come. I saw it coming up, and I didn't really understand what was going on until it happened. So when we moved out, we had to move in. My grandfather, they had already moved until we got the house set up again. My mother never got over moving, just like a lot of, she was raised here. So it was just a general upheaval of the way of life that people had known for 200 years. But for the ones that moved away, I guess maybe they bettered themselves, the ones that went to work in different places.
The late 20s and early 30s was a pivotal time in the creation of Mammoth Cave National Park. The Kentucky legislature had appropriated over $1.5 million to purchase lands and to cover the expenses of condemnation. The legislature also created the Kentucky National Park Commission, which was charged with handling land acquisition. A final act by the legislature was the passage of the Jurisdiction Bill, which transferred the park area from Kentucky jurisdiction to federal authority.
Throughout the late 20s and on into the 30s and late 30s, it was just kind of a methodical process of going, you know, house by house, place by place, and purchasing these properties that were owned by these families and getting, again, the minimum numbers of acreage that we needed. So probably for a good solid decade and a half, this land acquisition occurred in order for Mammoth Cave to become a national park.
1933 saw the arrival of the Civilian Conservation Corps at Mammoth Cave.
The CCC's role was tremendous. There were several hundred individuals that were there in what is today the park. There were 4 separate camps.
Vernon Wells came to Mammoth Cave as part of the Civilian Conservation Corps that returned the land of farms and homes back to its natural state. He was interviewed in 1987 for an oral history project at Western Kentucky University and has since passed away.
Well, every time one of the homes was vacated or any of the buildings vacated, they demolished the buildings. And of course, any usable lumber was given to the local people if they asked for it, or any materials that could be of use to either former owners or tenants or people who had a need for the materials. Anything else was burned up, and the places were demolished, and the area was leveled. And they, of course, they tried to dispose of the fencing and other indications of the habitation of man. They did a great deal of work as far as erosion control was concerned and reforestation, because the land there had been in use for 140 or 150 years. Most of the people were descendants of the original settlers in the area, and the land had been occupied for a long, long time, and it had been used and abused, and they began to work to control that. Of course, they set out trees to reforest the areas, and so it was a gradual rebuilding or restoration of the land into its original state. But the Three Sea Boys were, of course, busy building roads. They were busy working in the Mammoth Cave itself, improving the trails and the walkways, the bridges, and other wood structures in the cave. They, of course, their primary priority was given to improvement of the roads. They had gravelled just about all the main roads. By this time, too, quite a number of the local people had secured employment around the camps at various types of jobs, skilled jobs and unskilled jobs. And some of the enrollees married into these local families. So that all helped a great deal to decrease the hostility.
That hostility came about when landowners were removed from the property that they had sold to the state. They'd been told by land buyers that they could remain even after the sale. Acting Superintendent Robert Holland was charged with removing anyone who refused to relocate.
These land buyers had, because they were absolutely ignorant of what a national park was like, or maybe because they were directed to do so, we never did really find out why, they misled these people into believing that if they sold out, that they would be required to move. At least they wouldn't be required to move for years and years, probably during their lifetime. And they entered into what those people called gentlemen's agreements. Now, these were only verbal agreements. There was never anything like that put in writing. But these people believed that these agreements were valid. So that was the cause of a tremendous hostility that later developed. Because they had thought they had been betrayed when they found out that they were going to have to vacate the land. And they continued to use those farms within the boundary, just as they had when they owned them. Well, Mr. Holland told us to get the word out among the population within the boundary who lived on park land that they were going to have to move. And we did. Joe and I spread the word around that the Park Service was not going to accept it for a national park down there. It was never going to become a national park until they all moved off. But nobody moved.
Wells took on the role of a park ranger, and he and Joseph Ridge had the difficult and often dangerous task of removing anyone who would not leave the land that had been sold.
One old fellow, I recall, he lived on Flint Ridge. He was as I remember, a widower. At least he lived alone in his home there. And he said that he was never going to move. And if anybody tried to move him off, it'd be a gun battle. So we found out, though, that he had a daughter who lived up in Horse Cave, and she had been for some time trying to get him to move. He was pretty well up in years. They'd come and live with her, but he refused to do it. He said he was going to stay there. So we conspired with his daughter to take him to her home for a visit one day. And while he was gone, we took a crew of 3 Sea Boys from No. 1 camp and a bulldozer over there, and we demolished that house. So when he came back, there was not anything there but a pile of lumber on the ground. Of course, he was very irate about the thing, and I'm sure he would try to kill us if we'd been around. But Mr. Holland was a very, very determined person, and it was his job to get the thing moving down there. And when he saw, after he'd been there a year or so, saw that it was impossible to move quickly in any other way, why we had to resort to these forcible tactics in order to get the land vacated. Otherwise, Mammoth Cave National Park would have been many, many years after that in becoming a reality.
Progress always comes with a price. As many as 600 families were moved from their farms and homes to make way for Mammoth Cave to become a national park.
And I think that really speaks volumes as to how unique that Mammoth Cave is. That out of all the places that they could have chosen east of the Mississippi, Mammoth Cave was one of those 3 spots that they designated as worthy of becoming a national park. And we became a national park July 1st, 1941. And since that time, we have found out a lot of really cool things about Mammoth Cave. But one of the biggest things, and one of the things that has certainly changed since those early days, is today we are the world's longest known cave system. And they didn't know that in 1941. They knew the cave was unique, they knew it was special, they knew that the river valleys and the terrain that we had was certainly worthy of note. But it just seems that over time, that has been nothing but reinforced.
From the park's founding, legal provisions were made for the Park Service to maintain churches and cemeteries, as well as access to roads for use by the public. The communities might have disappeared with the creation of the park, but that legacy of close-knit ties remains, with reunions that are still held each year in places like Good Spring Church.
After the park had took the land, well then the families still wanted to go back and visit, and they established the homecoming, to my understanding, was always the last Sunday in May before the park had took. And so then the families would all, regardless where they moved to, they would all congregate back, and it would be a humongous crowd there. And especially when I was growing up, when I was a teenager, well, you couldn't hardly park everybody. They came from out of state and everywhere else, and they came back. And it was people that had lived on the park, and even if they hadn't owned property, their mom and dad, their family had. And so they'd come back. And as the years passed, well, of course, a lot of those have deceased, and you've got a younger generation of people, but you still got quite a few people that has family ties of homesteads back down around the Good Spring in Buffalo community and Sand Spring down in that area.
When I come to this area, especially into the Good Spring, and I think, I'm walking on the ground that my family walked on. I'm sitting in the church that my family sat in. I'm standing where my mother got salvation. Very special memories. And in a way, I kind of resent because my birthright was taken from me. I think it's good for Kentucky, and of course it's one of the 7 natural wonders of the world, and they receive many, many tourists, but it was at an expense of 600 families and their homes.
The legacy of those individuals is kept alive, and I think in a lot of different ways. For one, a lot of the place names that they used, those place names are still in use today. Good Spring is still Good Spring, and I suspect it always will be. Regardless of when the generations that originally lived there, once they all pass away, that's still going to be Good Spring. No one will forget it. It's there. So where they were will always be. So keeping those places, like those cemeteries, alive, I think really is a good way to keep that legacy going. There's certainly some structures that still stand. There are 3 churches that are in the park. And a lot of time in those days, those churches were essentially the cornerstones of that community. I would say the greatest legacy that those individuals have left, that is remembered, is every single day that we're open. It's the land itself, the sacrifice they made. They just gave it up for the whole world to come and see. And now hundreds of thousands of people a year, millions of people since we've become a park, have come here and connected to the land also, and they found their own meanings. They may have never owned land here. They may have never lived in Kentucky ever. They may have no blood connection, but they certainly have emotional or intellectual connections to the place, in the sense that maybe it's just feeling like you're the only person in the world at a backcountry site, or enjoying the serenity of the river as you canoe, or maybe it's you and your family. You're out, you're bonding together, you're sharing a tour with them and sharing this time and these moments with them. And those connections for those people are just as great as folks that live there, or for me that had blood ties there. And so that's perhaps their greatest legacy, is the land and the place that they called home is now a place that people from all over the world can come and feel a part of. And their legacy is a national park, a place set aside to be preserved and protected for future generations.
Production funding for Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home, comes from the Mammoth Cave National Park Association and the Friends of Mammoth Cave National Park, as well as the Kentucky Tourism Arts and Heritage Cabinet celebrating Kentucky's unbridled spirit, and from supporting members of WKU-PBS.
In the heart of South Central Kentucky, Mammoth Cave National Park is a draw for people from around the world. This area holds the longest known cave system on Earth and a rich history. Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home, is a tale of communities lost and a national park gained, as a legacy to those who knew and loved the cave and for those who would come after.